Here is a critical point that is generally overlooked. The anti-Semitism of the Nazis had a great appeal already in the mid-1930s to many Arab nationalists and Islamic fundamentalists.
From the mid-30s, from 1936 on, Hitler and his propaganda sections made a great effort to win over the Arab peoples of the Middle East.
We see that the undisputed leader of the Palestinian Arab national movement of the 1920s, 1930s and 40s, Hajj Amin al-Husayni, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was a fervent admirer of Adolf Hitler.
The Mufti was one of the founders of the radical Islamic movement, and Hitler saw at once that this man not only could serve his purpose, but wanted to serve his purpose.
There is a very important meeting between Hitler and the Mufti of Jerusalem on the 28th of November 1941, of which we have a full protocol. And what Hitler explains is that this is first and foremost a war of extermination against Jewry, and he tells him to lock this secret in his heart. He is revealing it to the Mufti. It's extraordinary he should choose the leader of the Palestinian Arab National Movement for this revelation, which is in an official German document.
It seemed strange to us that a Mufti who was not a pure Aryan was being received by Hitler. But they said, no, we have the same goal, which is the extermination of the Jews.
The Mufti was sent to the Balkans, where he raised a Bosnian Muslim SS division.
He had several SS divisions, the Handschar division, for example, where they had nominally Croatian officers, but the rank and file of the unit were entirely Muslim, Arab Muslims, and they were bringing them in from all over the world.
I was utterly astonished that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem had raised a Panzer division of Bosnian Muslims to fight along the Waffen-SS. The fanatic Muslim world and Hitler both agreed that no ideology can exist beyond theirs. It's all-encompassing.
A secular dogma like Nazism is less dangerous than this Islamofascism that we see today. It's less dangerous because Islamofascism has a religious twist to it. It says God the Almighty ordered you to do this, not the Führer, you know. So it is way more dangerous. It's trying to grow itself in 55 Muslim states, so potentially you could have a success rate of several Nazi Germanys if these people get their way.
Hitler's gone and dead. The German people are not the Nazis of 1944, but the Muslims have never wavered in their goal, which really is, if they possibly could, to kill all of the Jews. I'm convinced of that.
If radical Islamic fundamentalists had their way, we would have another Holocaust. There's absolutely no doubt about that. If al-Qaeda could produce it, they would.
But what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews, as the West, and Europe in particular, is slowly but surely beginning to understand.
Well, I think it was the most unpleasant job that I've ever had to do in the whole of my service.
I don't think, looking back now to those times, that it was a question of anti-Semitic or things like this. I understand that they felt they had to do a nasty and unpleasant and not human job.
It didn't seem right that they should come out of these DB camps and sort of sail to a land that they were going to call their own, to be just captured and taken back again. It was just like Hitler's days back. I couldn't understand it.
Well, we think the Exodus was the most important event on the way of the Jewish people to an independent state.
The Promised Land. Palestine in 1947 was still a predominantly Arab country. Since the First World War, it had been ruled as a mandate by the British, who found it useful strategically as a staging post on the route to India. Jewish immigration had been slow until the 1930s and had been controlled by the British. But Britain was faced with an insoluble problem: how to keep the 30-year-old pledge of a Jewish home in Palestine and at the same time keep faith with Palestine's Arab majority. The Second World War had radically changed the problem of Jewish immigration. Tens of thousands of survivors from the concentration camps and survivors of the persecution in Eastern Europe, with no homes to go to and no desire to stay in the continent where millions of their race had been slaughtered, now wanted to forget Europe and live in Palestine. In London, the new Labour government met Palestinian leaders in one of the endless attempts to bring about peaceful coexistence between Arab and Jew. But the Arabs, as usual, saw no reason for a Jewish state in a country they'd lived in for centuries. They wanted a ban on Jewish immigration. They declined partition. Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, and Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister, worried about Soviet intentions in the Middle East, were determined that the British should not offend the Arabs and drive them into the arms of the Russians. The conference predictably failed. In Palestine, there was an equally predictable reaction. Jewish terrorists now reopened their campaign of bombing and assassination. They'd already, by the end of 1946, killed 373 people, mostly civilians. They wanted an end to British occupation now and the establishment of a Jewish state. They were convinced that the British forces were pro-Arab. And after a European war in which 6 million Jews had died, the Jews could not tolerate the British quota system, which carefully rationed Jewish immigration to 1,500 a month. Rationing produced its particular black market of Jews trying to slip illegally into Palestine. The quota system also led the Haganah, the semi-secret Jewish militia, to set up a special branch which organized escape routes from Europe. The operation, known as Aliyah Bet, began in the 1930s to help Jews escape the mounting persecution in Eastern Europe and later in Germany. The main route was through the Balkans. Between 1934 and 1947, tens of thousands of Jews struggled along the Haganah routes, crossing borders illegally to reach ports in the Mediterranean. The boats which picked up the refugees were usually small or old or both. Some sank. And with the end of the war, the British could afford to strengthen the blockade by the Navy to stop the illegal traffic. Most refugee boats were caught by British warships, and the passengers were dispatched to camps in Cyprus to await their turn in the quota system. By 1947, the branch of Haganah which organized the journeys had shifted the center of its operations to France, and it now changed its tactics.
We decided to try to send not small boats as before from Italy, from Poland and so on. We decided to send ships of 4,000, 5,000 and even 40,000 people. And the first problem was to have a ship. And then we ordered our representative in the United States to buy a ship on the order of 4,000 or 5,000 people.
The Exodus, the ship they bought, began life as the President Warfield. She was launched in February 1928, Prohibition days, so a Mrs. Zachary Lewis smashed a bottle of spring water over her bows. The ship spent her youth quietly ferrying trippers round Chesapeake Bay on America's east coast. She enjoyed a brief moment of excitement with the troops in France after the invasion of Normandy, but by 1946 had apparently reached the end of her working life. She was about to be scrapped when she was saved from the breaker's yard by the Haganah representative for about £10,000. Ike Aran, then 23, was later to become the ship's captain.
Well, to me, the President Warfield was at the beginning a shock. But I quickly got used to her. And together with the crew, who were all Jewish volunteers from America, some of them seamen, we began to realize that this ship has certain features which would make it possible, with a certain initiative on our part, to break the British blockade, which was at that time blocking the Palestine coast.
The ship sailed from Philadelphia at the end of March 1947, and fortunately for her old timbers, the Atlantic crossing was moderately calm. On April the 30th, she arrived at Porto Venere on the northwest coast of Italy. The British Navy hovered in the background, aware from the start of the ship's ultimate destination. Throughout May and June, workmen modified the ship to take over 4,000 people. Sleeping space for each passenger was 20 inches wide. The boat was also prepared to repel British boarding parties.
We closed all the outside of the ship with barbed wire, so no one can jump inside to the ship. We prepared outside the ship a pipe with little holes inside, which this pipe was connected to the oil of the ship, and we intended to throw hot or boiling oil.
On July the 9th, the ship, now fully prepared and soon to be renamed the Exodus, arrived at Sète, where the refugees were waiting.
Most of our immigrants were from DP camps in Germany. We also had a few groups from North Africa and a few groups from France, Belgium.
You could find children without parents, a man without his wife, pregnant women, without identity cards, without money, and they had the only desire to sail and to come to Israel.
I was at the end of my 7 months of pregnancy, but I wanted very much to give birth in Israel. We came through Munich to a big camp near France. We stayed there for a week, and from there they took us to a ship.
We were from camps from Russia and from ghettos, and we wanted to go to Israel.
Well, we agreed with the Ministry of Interior to let, in one Sunday, 4,500 people from Germany. First thing what we had to do is to have some destination visas. We got somewhere a type of a Colombian visa. In a small hotel where I stayed, in the washroom, 2 of our people and me, we prepared 4,625 cards.
We came to Exodus. The ship wasn't big. I think there were about 4,500 people, almost 1,500 children, some without parents, and there were many pregnant women. Each person had but half a meter to stay, and it was very hot.
In order to prevent running around on the ship, and we organized them in groups of 30 with 1 man in charge of each group. This man was also responsible for getting the food and the water 3 times a day. And when we had some orders to give, we only talked to the so-called leaders of the 30s, as we called them.
Meanwhile, the French were busy resisting British demands to stop the ship sailing for Palestine. In the end, the French authorities decided to let the refugees go. The Exodus was originally licensed to carry a modest 400 passengers. It now carried over 4,000, and the immediate problem was how to extricate from a small harbour an unwieldy and grossly overcrowded ship.
We tried to contact a French pilot to take us out. And we fixed with him that he will come midnight, and we paid him 1,000,000 francs. But he didn't show up, so we decided to try by ourselves to leave the harbor. Already it was day, we succeeded to come out, and we sailed to the sea. When we came out, we already met the first British ship, which was waiting for us outside the harbor, and the British aeroplane were above us.
It was a very difficult trip because we were laying one by another. We couldn't even turn from side to side, and everyone was seasick.
We had enough food and it was well organized, but not every child could digest it easily.
I was first sent out in the Childers to pick up President Warfield south of Crete, and so I had plenty of time to study the problem of boarding, and I took note of the fact that it would be essential in this case for us to board right on this top deck here. It made this operation probably the most difficult boarding operation that's ever been attempted in peace or war.
The reasons being that the main deck was low, but above the main deck there was a wooden superstructure which was about, I would say, 3 decks, so say 8 or 9 meters. And from what I knew about the tactics of the British boarding parties, which I had studied quite well, it would be almost impossible for British seamen from destroyers to come alongside and board this ship.
Now, normally we boarded by sticking the bows in like that and holding the ship in there by steering, and the sailors just jumping over the forecastle. This could not be done in this case. So we built boarding platforms, which is painted black here, abreast the bridge. Now, the limitations there were that they're very narrow with the timber we had available, only room for 6 or 7 folk to board at once, and they were at the turning point of the ship. When you close in to board like this, no man can jump until the 2 fore-and-aft lines are parallel. And that, having reached that position, the tendency for the ship at once is to spring out with the momentum of the turn plus the water pressure between the bows, and so there's only time for half a dozen chaps to board at one alongside, which, when you consider that there was over 1,000 people resisting, as well armed as our own boarding parties, it made very considerable demands on the young men concerned.
It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. And when the British announced on their loudspeakers with big flaring blue lights that we are now, quote, entering the territorial waters of Palestine, and I was at that time on the bridge. I was on the Monkey Island, in fact. I was simply shocked. I couldn't believe that this would happen at that moment.
I was very afraid because I was only 17 then, and I didn't know what will be, what will become of us.
I immediately ran down and tried to give 2 blasts, which means hard port, namely that I'm turning away, which if we would have been in territorial waters would have meant that we are out of them. And the siren got stuck, and there was one horrible blast of this siren, which was a siren of a passenger ship, which is very, very loud. And it was an eerie thing. And about, I don't know, 10 minutes or 2 or 5 minutes afterwards, the destroyers started ramming us.
The orders we had on ramming were explicit. It had to be avoided at all costs. What happened was that we, by reversing the outer screw, were able to slide in like that, and just momentarily, half a dozen chaps got over, with the aid of Chinese crackers, our secret weapon for this operation, which brought all the Jews in the vicinity of the landing to their knees. And those lads managed to force their way into the wheelhouse and take control of the ship, turn her out to seaward, and until the Jews changed over to the after steering position when they could no longer influence the movements of the ship.
They throw a lot of gas bombs to our side, and we throw them back. They shoot a lot of shooting, but we find out this, most of them were without bullets, only to make noise.
The immigrant rushed forward to meet us, brandishing clubs, bottles, and throwing cans. The noise was indescribable. To add to the chaos, tear gas canisters had been thrown from the destroyers, and our eyes were stinging. We had hoped to reach our primary objective, but it was obvious from the start we were never going to make it.
The British tried, and they did, to put boarding parties on our deck. At the first 2 or 3 tries, they didn't succeed. We pushed the boarding parties back into the sea, and they must have had a few men killed in this action.
My helmet had been sent spinning with a blow from a pick handle. I'd lost 2 front teeth, and I was bleeding from a cut on the forehead.
It was terrible. I can't even explain it. It was like a nightmare. Suddenly shots and cries and gas bombs and soldiers with clubs hit everybody, and suddenly I felt that I was hit very hard on my head.
Because the Jews still had control, she was weaving first one way and then the other continuously for about a couple of hours, which made it very, very difficult indeed to get alongside. And no ship did manage to get back alongside again for 30 minutes after that initial boarding. And those 6 lads held out there unsupported for all that time. When they did get reinforcements, and the total number of effectives on board were never more than 33 against over 1,000 men resisting, their presence roaming about the ship, I think, must have persuaded most of the immigrants that we had complete control of the ship, and consequently, after quite a lot of their fellows had been injured, including the mate who died of a Kosh wound in the wheelhouse when he refused to leave the wheel, a heavily bandaged member of the crew came up and said that they'd had enough.
After these hours of battle in which many people were wounded badly, our high command, I don't know who, I wouldn't want to say who, decided that this was too much for us to put up with, that this for civilians was not the right thing to do, and that we should call off the fight. I am convinced till now, completely convinced, and so are most of the crew who were professional seamen, that this ship could have been beached in spite of this battle, as was planned by us, in order to show that one can achieve by the power of hundreds of thousands of homeless refugees something which no empire or no navy can withstand.
When I woke up, I was in a small room, and I didn't know what happened. And then came my mother, and she saw me in such a condition. She began to cry, and what happened? She thought that I am going to die because I was all in blood.
We thought that the British would play fair. Not that I blame them, but they did not play completely fair. They attacked this ship not instead of 3 miles, which are the territorial waters, 5 miles, but they attacked it 21 miles off the shores of Palestine.
We had hopes that the Exodus, being a very fast ship, she could sail well over 20 knots, could maybe escape by trying to outrun the British cruiser and the British destroyers. We didn't imagine for a second that we could outrun them for a long time or for a long way, but we thought that we could do it for about 3 miles, which is the limit of the territorial waters, and then we could put our ship onto the beach almost, because the Exodus was originally a riverboat, so she could easily run almost up to shore. but an English warship can't. So we thought that this helping, we would make the escape. But we didn't, since the British did attack us long before we were ready to make this move.
I was preoccupied as one of their initial boarding pair at the moment of boarding with preparations and watching the President Warfield. But what I do know is that we had our automatic plot running, and that during the period of the boarding operation, the President Warfield made good about 5 miles to seaward. During that period, and consequently, come the dawn, we were well outside territorial waters.
At daylight, the struggle was over. 3 Jews died as a result of the fighting. 28 needed hospital treatment. Remarkably, all the members of the boarding party who'd been thrown overboard were picked up, and British casualties were only 3 men badly hurt.